So, welcome back, everybody, to our very last panel of this Outer Space Security Conference 2024. I'm sure you're all very sad that this is the last panel that we'll be having. I know I am. The discussions so far have been excellent. And the lineup of panelists that we have for this session is very exceptional. So, I'm very excited to talk to these experts. This last panel is going to focus on verification and monitoring. It's titled A Verification and Monitoring Toolbox for Space Security. I'm going to be the one moderating this panel. So I will be telling you a little bit about the panel itself and then introducing our studied panel. So verification and monitoring have long been an important and complex topic in arms control and disarmament measures. And we've heard a little bit about this throughout the conference. And of course, verification is important to space. This panel will explore the opportunities presented by new technologies and tools for monitoring and verification of space activities, as well as some of the technical, political, and financial challenges to verification and monitoring. I'm very excited to be joined by Darren McKnight here to my right. He is a senior technical fellow at Leo Labs. Dr. Darren McKnight leads efforts to realize the value proposition for the growing global network of ground-based radars for space situational awareness, space safety, and space sustainability. He creates new data depictions, develops risk algorithms, and leads space incident investigations. I'll be very interested to hear what that looks like. He's also focusing on creating new statistical collision risk assessment approaches to provide a valuable context to the operational collision avoidance supports provided by Leo Labs worldwide. We also have Hugo André Costa. He is an executive board member for the Portuguese Space Agency. He is currently Portugal's representative at the Committee of Outer Space Affairs, also at the European Commission, ESA Council, and he acts as chairman of the International Relations Committee at ESA. During his time at the Portuguese Space Agency, Hugo has successfully chaired the Council Working Group in preparation for the Space Council in 2021 and led the working group of the space component of the Portuguese presidency of the EU Council in achieving the conference manifesto, the Lisbon Manifesto on EO for Africa and Europe. We also have Sarah Eriksson, who you've already met. She is a research assistant on space security and also for the WMD program at Unity. She not only leads the portals, I believe it was yesterday. So she leads her post work, but she also was the Unity lead for the recently concluded GDE, of which we've talked plenty during these past few days. And during the GDE, Unity submitted several working papers. One of them was on verification, and Sarah led the drafting of this working group. And I'll be very excited to hear what this working paper entailed and what information Unity provided to the representatives, the experts in the group. Sarah has a dual master's degree from the Middlebury Institute on International Studies at Monterey and Moscow State Institute of International Relations in WMD, Non-Proliferation, Nuclear Policy and Global Security. And she has worked with the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, the Russian Center for Policy Research, PIR Center, and the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. Sarah is also currently a PhD student at Maryland University in the US. Thomas Gonzalez-Roberts is a postdoctoral fellow at the Georgia Institute of Technology. He is an astrodynamicist. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Yeah, sorry. And policy advisor for outer space affairs. He is a postdoctoral fellow, as I was saying, at the Georgia Institute of Technology's Sam Nunn School for International Affairs, as well as an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. His research interests include international coordination, sustainability, and security in space. So, as you can see, we have an excellent group of experts, a mixture of policy as well as technical people. So I'm very excited to talk about these issues of verification and monitoring, which are very important in the space security debate. We don't often get that technical side of things. So I'm very excited to have that technical angle in these discussions as well. I thought that maybe we could start with Sarah. As I was saying, she has done work on verification for Unity, and I think it would be great for her to set the scene and provide us an overview of verification and monitoring in multilateral debates, including issues that have been raised in the context of space security, and maybe, if you'd like, also comparisons to other fields. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Almu. Thank you all as well for your attention. So I do think it's kind of important to set the scene a little bit in some context on verification. So just to set that scene, verification generally can be understood as this process, right, of collecting and assessing data, but really with the view of then informing judgment of a state's compliance with treaty obligations. So oftentimes we think of verification process maybe in three parts. The first is that monitoring and that collecting of data. The second part is really then doing a technical analysis of that information that you collect. And then the third part would be really drawing from those first two steps in order to then reach a judgment to whether a state is compliant. And I just want to underscore that third step of the process to really highlight verification being tied with compliance. So this inherently means that verification is a technical process and a political process. Because the interpretation of the data and that determining of compliance really is then a political judgment then that has to be made. So sometimes we can hear verification being used interchangeably with monitoring or sometimes confused as synonyms, but just to kind of highlight that they're not synonyms and that they're separate kind of concepts. But to give some more context into verification within multilateral debates, states have kind of come to this understanding of general principles under the purview of the United Nations. So we often hear the terms of adequate and effective that are associated with verification. So there is this widespread recognition that a verification regime is not going to be perfect, nor can it really be perfect, but the goal is really to be able to detect violations in a timely manner for states then to be able to take appropriate action and to deter non-compliance. So when it comes to space security, a little bit more specifically, we do have quite a robust toolbox of data collection methods that can support verification. Oftentimes the first one you hear of is SSA. So really, right, it's that characterization and the practice of tracking space objects in their operational environment with the view to understand their position and maybe as well as to predict and understand their positions in the future. I don't want to talk too much more because we're going to have some excellent people talking more about SSA, but it's not just SSA. So I want to highlight some other tools within those data collecting processes. So we can also think of data exchange, declarations, notifications. Our previous panel did a wonderful job of talking about some of those that could be considered the voluntary guidelines, HCOC, but these types of methods as well make information a lot more available on space activities. So we can think about exchange of data, for example, on location, number, characteristics, status of equipment that could be limited by an agreement. And so it could help provide a more holistic view about what a state space activity looks like in general. And we can also think of Earth observation. This has more traditionally been included in the national technical means of a state. And it does provide insight into the activities and facilities of a state. When we're thinking about space security, we can also think about how Earth observation can help us track the development or construction of new launch pads, for example, or even the deployment of mobile launcher platforms as well. Something that the previous panel also touched upon was more of this incoming concept of small launchers. So Earth observation could help with that. And then similar to that, we have on-site activities as well. Although oftentimes considered a little bit more intrusive and so maybe harder to achieve. We have, and there is a possibility of including inspections of facilities, but also discussions with personnel that work at facilities, inspection of launch vehicles or spacecraft even. There's the monitoring of launch even before or during. And so this can also help, corroborate other forms of data that you may get with what you're seeing through these visits. But one of the ones that I want to highlight is open source data. So there's this, rich growth of publicly available data. And what it's been able to do is facilitate these global citizen kind of monitoring or open source intelligence communities, if you will. And although, of course, we know that it doesn't substitute for the formal processes of state, what I think is really fascinating is that we're able to have these open intelligence analyst communities that can contribute to the conversation of monitoring that could maybe then feed up towards verification processes, because we're able to have this in an open manner. So when we're thinking of open source data, we can think of catalogs and databases that are public, that discuss or that track movement of satellites and other space assets, but also public information on the movements of military or even personnel associated with certain military space forces or space programs. There's also patent data, which would be very, very fascinating on certain space technologies, social media, of course, and so forth. So while but I do want to just kind of give the caveat or talk a little bit about those limitations of some of what this toolbox is. So although it is robust and although it is evolving, thankfully, we do just have to keep in mind some limitations of that, right? Although SSA is wonderful and an incredible tool, it's not without its challenges, right? Of maintaining persistent and comprehensive coverage, I think. And for open source information, we also have to think, of course, of chains of custody of information, but also biases that may happen in interpretation of that data. And of course, there's always the political inhibitions that may deter some of these agreements from being able to take place, whether in official capacity or even just voluntary capacities, right? So there's those political and regulatory informations that we would have to keep in mind that could also limit this. But I think what's maybe most important to stress is that none of these tools can really work just by themselves, right? So we have to think of it more as a layered approach, packaged approach, and then talking a little bit about the GGE. Within the report from the GGE, that this idea too of a layered approach to verification came through. And so I think it is well understood, but just to be emphasized that it's best to think of it as all of these things complementing one another to really get a better picture of what's happening. I do want to just talk a little bit really quickly about some provisions that exist currently in the international space kind of legal regime that could be useful just in implanting these in the discussion going forward. So if we think of Article 9 in the OST, right, it's about consultations, but I think consultations are extremely important to the verification process. If you're coming up with, oh, we don't understand what this data is, so let's have a place for discussion. So state parties to OST, they can either undertake or request consultations if they think that there's activity that's going to happen that could potentially be harmful interference. We also have Article 10, though, in the Outer Space Treaty, which includes opportunities to observe the flight of space objects of another state. So I think this is, we're talking, or maybe I'm getting ahead of myself with some ideas, so wait, but I just want to flag that that the opportunity to observe flight of space objects is also enshrined in the Outer Space Treaty, as we have Article 11 in the Outer Space Treaty, which talks about or stipulates about sharing information, right? So of course we have the Registration Convention, Article 5 in the Registration Convention, which really outlines more of this process of sharing information. But if anything doesn't fall maybe specifically into the parameters of the Registration Convention, we always have the Outer Space Treaty Article 11 and also other UN resolutions. So if there's not even a state party, so that there's channels of getting information out there to the public. And maybe I'll just end on Article 12 of the Outer Space Treaty, because this one, fascinating, it does include provisions for on-site visits when it comes to the activity on celestial bodies. So we always think of Article 4, Outer Space Treaty, right? It prohibits WMDs launched into outer space, but it also forbids establishment of military bases, installations, fortifications, and then the testing of any types of weapons or the conduct of military maneuvers that could take place in a celestial body. So maybe getting a little science fiction and my Carl Sagan being all excited, going too forward into the future. But at some point, if we think of Article 12, we have these useful provisions that could already allow states the cooperation to be able to do on-site visits to their activities on celestial bodies. So just kind of wanted to give that framework, and I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you for finishing with the OST. Anybody that quotes the OST to me, that's music to my ears. I always say that we don't rely on it enough, or we don't talk about it enough. We're always thinking of, oh, what can we do that's new? And that's great. But while we work on new mechanisms and while we work on new initiatives, we cannot forget that we already have a very successful instrument, which is the Outer Space Treaty, that already gives us a lot of instructions relating to how we can proceed, not just when it comes to space safety issues or the peaceful use of outer space, which of course that is the case, but also space security. So thank you for that. Also, thank you for highlighting that verification and monitoring are two different things. Terminology is so important, as we've been discussing throughout the whole conference. And also the fact that different verification tools work best when they are used together, and that we will probably never have a perfect verification and monitoring regime, especially because the field is changing, technology is being developed, and as it continues to develop and evolve, so will the methods that we use to verify and monitor compliance with obligations and commitments. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And having said that, I would like to turn to you, Darren. You are, of course, a representative of an industry actor, and it would be great to hear from somebody who actually uses these tools in their everyday today. And maybe you can talk a little bit more about what these tools are like, how they can be used for verification and monitoring, and how can they ensure space security.
All right, so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. And I am not a diplomat like my colleague Jessica Talk, who's very polite and very open. I'm a scientist. I like facts. I don't really care about opinions when facts are available. So I'm going to give you some facts today, and these facts are based on a lot on the infrastructure at Leo Labs, the infrastructure we have at Leo Labs. As Amu said, I'm a senior technical fellow. That means I'm old. I still do calculations. I'm a nice guy. All right. And so I think that's really important when we do work, as Sarah talked about. We have content, but we need context. So I've been doing this since the mid 80s. Don't do the math. Don't do the math. I'm a young man. But I've been doing this since the mid 80s. A lot of things have changed since the mid 80s. And a lot of people who've been involved in space for 2 years, 10 years, 15 years, they think they have it figured out. It's a long story. It's a novel, and we need to pull it all together. And one of the things, the way that we pull that together, is really capacity and knowledge, I think, drive deterrence. It's kind of like parenting, right? If you have 2 kids and you have 2 parents, you have capacity and you have knowledge, you know what's going on, you can do a better job parenting. We need, as a global community, to do a better job at parenting, right? Our global community and our space systems. The way that Leo Labs does that, and again, this is not a marketing pitch, but I'm trying to show you what is required to provide this ubiquitous collection of content to help in the verification for both safety and for space security. First off, the global network of radars. The diagram shows you where you have radars all over the place. Hugo let us put a radar in Portugal. Thank you very much. We're looking for other great places to put radars. We want a geographically diverse set of radars, so that way we see everything that's in orbit many, many times a day, on the order of 8 to 10 times a day. All right? So persistent monitoring is important, just like children. Got to watch them all the time, right? So you got to watch them all the time. Next, cloud-based computational engine. We actually use Amazon Web Services. We are responsive in our calculations. Within 5 minutes after any object crosses one of our radars, we've updated the state vector for that object. If that's involved in any number of potential conjunctions over the next 5 days, we recalculated all those potential conjunctions, all the probability of collisions, and delivered them to our customers. So this isn't like looking at the stock market on Sunday morning with your grandpa. It's a streaming data to tell you what's going on related to space safety. Okay, and we do the same thing applied to space security. So we have to be persistent. We've got to be able to be responsive and see changes when they happen quickly. The last thing is, we don't just look at an object as a dot in space. Sarah mentioned about curation, right? And so we have what we call a curated catalog. Every object that's in orbit, 23,000 that we monitor every single day, around 23,000, we actually have features, characteristics, mass, who built it, what's the propulsive capability. All of those things are really important because the proximity of two objects varies a lot on what they are. Not just that they're within 1 kilometer, do they have a camera on board? All of those things are put in there, okay? And so we know that there's object characterization, event characterization, like behaviors, moving around another object in a rapid, very close proximity, whether it's your own system or somebody else's system, that needs to be characterized because object capabilities along with behavior really defines threat. And the threat isn't just man-made, it's also environmental. We're worried about 2 objects colliding that were launched in 1980s. So all that's very important because we have to scale to this new growth of satellites that are coming on board, right? It's not sufficient to say, we got some really good people back there looking at the keyboard. We've got to allow artificial intelligence, machine learning to help filter all of these activities. So AI is important when you're taking, you see off to the side here, 2 million radar measurements a day. So AI is important. We also apply, I was telling Hugo earlier, we also apply RI. Anybody heard about that new technology called RI? Anybody? Yeah, it's real intelligence, right? We often forget about that, right? We all want to do AI. We want to combine AI and RI, right? It's very important that content and context come together because there are things that happened in the 80s that are relevant to what's happening right now. And we try to pull all that together. On the screen up there, you see a couple things about capacity. 2 million radar measurements a day, 100,000 new state vectors a day, determine position nominally within 20 meters, positional uncertainty at epoch. So we know what you are and where you're going. That allows us to push out millions of conjunction data messages. We generate over 15,000 radar cross-section values. So not only do we curate the catalog, we also look at the size from the radar return, and we detect over 2,000 orbital maneuvers a day on orbit because we look at how things behave. All right, so let's go. So what does that mean? Does that mean like we're just all excited about numbers? No, we care about 3 major domains. We care about space security, oftentimes called space domain awareness instead of SSA because we don't have enough acronyms, right? We have to make another acronym up to say the same thing. I care about space safety, space traffic management, make sure that operational objects don't get hit by anything else. We provide these millions of conjunction data messages a day. I also care about space sustainability. Space sustainability are things that are up there been since the 80s. Are they going to end up banging together so that we will not be able to safely operate these constellations that are on the drawing board right now? That's important. All of those are important to us. So how does fact-based analysis help verification of space security issues, but also provide a means to ensure space safety and space sustainability? Well, I'm sorry, facts are needed. So I'm going to pull a thread. And you see how I show you these 3 things are related. I'm not going to show you the next chart, which is a fun one, which I'll invite you for a glass of wine later for us to discuss. But there's a relation here. I believe, despite some of the words I've heard over the last day and a half, that we do know what's bad behavior, right? And that maybe we need a low-hanging fruit behavior to say what is good and what isn't good. So let's look at debris mitigation. Many of you may know back in late 1990s to 2004, the international community said 25-year rule is acceptable. We shouldn't let objects linger for more than 25 years after their operational use. By the way, that's a ridiculously high number. The FCC has moved it to 5 years. It should be 1 year. But let's assume that 25 years is a good baseline, all right? Very low hurdle to pass. So from the beginning of space age to around 2004, we had a rapid abandonment of rocket body mass in low Earth orbit. That rocket body mass was done 90% by one country. No names here. By one country, all right? Since 2004, do you think we're doing better as a global community, worse, or about the same? Who thinks we're doing worse? Who thinks we're doing about the same? Who thinks we're doing better? Yeah, Victoria, that glass is always half full. Yay, Victoria. And Victoria, you're wrong. All right. So sorry, you're right, but you're wrong on this. So guess what? We've gotten worse. 60% of the mass that's been left has been by one country, no names. All right. Why is it that we cannot say that we agreed in 2004, don't leave objects up for more than 25 years, yet we continue to do it? If we can't agree on a simple thing like don't leave your trash where you're going to be working, I don't know how we're going to get some of these more subtle nuanced things done. So my proposal to this group is, let's find some low-hanging fruit. 25 years, that's not that hard. Don't launch satellites to 1,000 kilometers and leave the rocket body there. That's what a country did back in the 80s and the 90s, right? Why do we continue to do that? So 134 rocket bodies been left. Over 300,000 kilograms of dead mass in orbit's going to last for more than 25 years in the last 20 years. And there's no slowing in sight. That's not good. That's not good. And so I have like 100 threads to pull. I'm not going to pull those threads. If we go to the next chart, though, I'm going to show you that facts aren't the only thing that matters. It also matters how it all fits together. No, you can't read that. What you're going to do is get a copy. We'll get a glass of wine this evening, and we'll talk about this. But what's really important is you can't, I believe, you cannot treat space security in a vacuum, no pun intended. The relationships are tight. The facts help support that. If we can start to provide some fact-based decision-making and behavior for mitigation that we all can agree to, I think that will reduce tension, relate to space security. It will also improve our chances of being able to operate safely for many decades to come. That's how we use facts. AI, RI, both very, very important. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Darren. I think you finished there by saying that we cannot treat space security, on its own without thinking of space safety, of space sustainability. And I think this is an issue that has come up in other panels as well. Obviously, in the UN, we do have our space security fora, our space safety fora, but of course, there are certain issues that overlap or that are related to both. The way that we at Unity sometimes have talked about this is that sustainability is the thing that connects security and safety. So we think of it as the two sides of a coin, security and safety, make up that sustainability coin. And you need both of them. You need states and non-state actors making efforts in both of these areas in order to achieve that sustainability. So I also really liked what you mentioned, what you said about that curated catalog. And I want to go back to what Andrew in the first panel of today was talking about. He was talking about the registry that the UN has and that UNUSA manages. And I'd be very interested to hear how, as Sarah has mentioned, verification mechanisms work best when they are used together. How can states or non-state actors look at the data that you provide and connect it to that registration information? Is that helpful in any way? Would it be helpful to have more information when you register your space objects? I think it would be very interesting to think of these questions and see how we can answer them as we consider space security verification and monitoring. I'm going to move on to you, Thomas. You also have a science background, so I'm also very excited to learn from you. But you have a more academic perspective. I would be interested in knowing how can knowledge of satellite movements, like the ones that Darren was speaking about, and the activity of these satellites be achieved with the tools that we currently have, and can this knowledge be improved in any way or be used in a way that's more effective to contribute to space security?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. My voice is doing better than it was yesterday, so I think you'll be able to hear me okay. I am on this panel representing an academic perspective. I'm on the Faculty of International Affairs at the Georgia Institute of Technology, which is a public engineering college in the United States that hosts the largest aerospace engineering department in the world by many different measurements. And so I think it's appropriate that they recruited me just earlier this year, when I only joined a few months ago, to establish a laboratory between the International Affairs School and the Aerospace Engineering School that focuses on my research portfolio of space coordination, sustainability, and security. Plenty of overlap with the themes from my co-panelists earlier. And I argue that academics have a role to play outside of military organizations, civil government organizations, and commercial organizations to contribute to analysis of the space environment, especially as it relates to rule following. So a lot of this conversation in this conference today is dedicated to rule making. how do we get the important parties at the table to govern the next generation of spaceflight? And that's a critical conversation because the next generation of spaceflight looks different than what we see today. I'm very thankful that companies like Leo Labs exist because there's going to be an increasing densification of spaceflight activities in low Earth orbit. But I ask, how has rule following worked in the past? As we stare ahead for how to govern LEO, for example, how do we coordinate all of those mega constellation proposals with one another to prevent, of course, collision between objects? That's a space sustainability question, but also in everyday, day-to-day operations, how do we prevent harmful interference? The densification of the near-Earth space environment is a physical problem. So I'm glad we have physical scientists on board to help solve that. But it's also a spectral problem. There's a limited natural resource at play, and that's the radio frequency spectrum. In the future, there may be other ways for satellites to communicate to ground segments on the ground, and there's already been demonstrations for intersatellite links using optical communications, but the vast majority use radio. So in my group, I asked, is there an example where I can look at rules and study following using publicly available information? I'd love to look at the 25-year-old rule, Darren, but it hasn't been 25 years. We don't have rule breakers yet because we haven't crossed the 25-year threshold. The 5-year rule by the FCC was proposed less than 5 years ago. So I found an example right in my corner of the near-Earth space environment. That's the geostationary belt. I'm a geoastrodynamicist. I love the characterization of scientists on this panel. We do like to go specific and specific. Darren mentioned that he's a facts guy, but I think he's also an opinions guy. He didn't mention that country that left all that mass on orbit, but I'm not afraid to name names. I won't name your names for you, but I'll certainly name my own. So I asked in GEO, where there is an international coordination scheme that's been in operation for more than 40 years, and that's administered by the International Telecommunication Union, an international organization, a specialized agency of the UN, hosting a space sustainability conference right now down the street, that manages all the requests from all around the world of member states wishing to have protected access to the natural resource that is the geostationary belt as a physical domain and the radio frequency spectrum. The fractions, the bands that these different satellites use to communicate with their users on the ground. And so I developed a tool, and it's published. It's called the International Telecommunications, or ITU, Compliance Assessment Monitor, to ask, in the past 10 years, how often do member states adhere to their orbital prescriptions? They work so hard in I would call an arduous process to earn protections from the ITU, where if they follow those rules and their neighbors follow those rules, they will not experience harmful interference in GEO. And I was curious, because I've noticed as an astrodynamicist studying GEO, that satellites move around. They change their longitudinal position. I'm not just talking about small station keeping, I'm talking about wide shifts in what fraction of the Earth's surface they can observe at a time. And those shifts largely have developed after the agreement of these GEO rules, which were established in a pair of special conferences at the ITU in the 1980s. And I was curious, are satellite operators adhering to their orbital slotting guidelines as part of this process? You really could. If you're at an orbital slot that you have protections, and you're migrating to a new slot that you also have protections, and you also turn off your radio along the way, those natural drifts take weeks or months in the GEO belt, you could be in compliance with the ITU's rules. But I hypothesized that regular space operations in GEO regularly put satellites and their operators out of compliance with the radio regulations. Now, I thought that was a really simple question, but it ended up being one where facts are at play, but a lot of opinions are at play. The ITU, as the administrator of these rules, cannot issue a compliance assessment report. All of ITU's authorities are given by its members. Member states are governing themselves on whether or not these rules are being followed and how these new rules are being proposed. So I think academics has a very special role to play. We do it from the outside. So I think I have some time on this committee, but I wanted to just preview some of the results of my work. The International Telecommunication Monitor tool that I created issues assessments on a daily basis. You can check whether a satellite is in compliance right now. But I also issued some historical compliance assessments. Over the past 10 years, how have entire fleets, and think national government satellite fleets, have been in compliance? And this is where I'm not afraid to name some names. The average across the space satellite population in GEO exhibits poor compliance. At any given time, only 64% of satellites are in compliance with orbital prescriptions in their ITU satellite networks. 64%, that's the average number. So let's just think about the three largest GEO satellite operators, the countries that operate more GEO satellites than anyone else. It's the same three players that you might suspect because they are the three global superpowers in the space domain across a number of different corners of the space environment. The biggest actor, the United States, has a little bit better than average, just 66% of their fleet is in compliance at any given time. And these are numbers that are averaged over the past 10 years or so, more than 10 years. China does a bit better than the United States. I can name names when it's good too. And that's about 73% of Chinese satellites in their fleet are in compliance at any given time. But there's another enormous operator in this GEO domain that has a poorer record of compliance, and that's Russia at just 44%. But there are a number of different takeaways you can pull from this sort of tool. And I wanted to sort of predict some of the accusations of bias that I might experience when I give these sorts of results in international fora like this. And that is, where does the data come from? In the case of the results I shared with you just now, I used the most comprehensive publicly available data, and that's the US Space Force catalog. So that's from one of those main three superpowers. However, ITU-CAM, and I'll use that abbreviation for that tool in particular, is data agnostic. It's open source, and you can plug in whatever data you have describing historical longitudinal positions for GEO satellites. You don't have to use Space Force data, and I think that you shouldn't if you have access to better data, as many operators do, and commercial SSA providers do as well. So I implore you to take a look at these results. There's an upcoming CSIS report. My other affiliation at the Center for Strategic and International Studies is releasing a report with these results. And I've partnered with Privateer Space, a data aggregator in the US, with their Wayfinder tool, and that's coming online soon to issue those daily assessments. You can look at the entire geosatellite population and learn more about whether they're in compliance with their ITU orbital prescriptions. And with that, I do want to turn it back over to you, Elma. Thanks for giving me the floor.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for that really interesting overview. And I really like your point about how academics, and I think this also applies to civil society as well, how they can help states by, in a way, holding them accountable or letting them know, like, hey, these are the tools that exist that maybe you're not implementing, or you could be implementing better than you are. Because I liked your point about how we tend to talk about rulemaking, and again, I go back to something that I said before. You know, we try to do new things all the time. New is exciting, of course, so there is a tendency to try to innovate, and that is absolutely great. But sometimes looking at what we already have and how we can make the most of that, and how we can ensure that we're implementing. We were talking about TCBMs before, how we're implementing those TCBMs, or whatever other mechanisms or initiatives that might already exist, how those can be implemented and put into practice is also really important. And so it's very impressive that you use this already existing tool to assess these percentages of compliance. So yeah, I'd be very interested to see how states, now that they are going to have this data available to them, how they can they can try to maybe improve, or they can try to see why maybe the compliance rates are not as good as they should be. The question that I had for you, Hugo, is you come from a state space agency, so I'd like to know about that perspective, and it'd be great to learn what is the relevance of verification and monitoring in the context of your work, in the context of a space agency, and how you consider these questions when you engage in policy making, both in Portugal at the domestic level, but also when you engage in these discussions at the multilateral level.
Thank you very much for your invitation to the Portuguese Space Agency and myself to be here. It's a pleasure to contribute to the discussion. And I will bring, yes, a perspective of a small or a young space agency. We are 5 years old. Although the Portuguese space activity started before, but let's say took a few years to set up things in Portugal and to actually find the need to have a space agency and to have a different framework to work within the country. And the agency was created late in 2019 after the publishing the Portuguese space law and also the Portuguese space strategy. So it was a process that was taken within due time, and just not jumping forward to build a space agency and then we see what we're going to do. No, there was a strategy behind it. There was also the Portuguese space law. And when we started, our motto was a sustainable space for a sustainable Earth. And we have very much since the very beginning supporting our industry and our academics on that. So how we can on Portugal participate on missions, mainly from ESA to have a sustainable space. Also in terms of policy, what you can do to promote that. But of course, looking to our planet and what we can also base with space observations can support the sustainability on Earth. And if we jump into the space sustainability, which from our point of view, it's a dual use in monitoring space, because if we monitor the space activities for sustainability, then of course we can also use that data for security reasons. But as a nation that is giving the first steps in space activities and a small agency, one of the things that we can do it's through policy making and to support policy activities. And with that, we this year, and actually it's next week, we're going to have at the United Nations the Summit of the Future, which will be a key moment for United Nations to set up the next years of the activities at UN. And so the member states will come together next week and discuss the Pact for the Future. And for the first time, space is going to be discussed at the highest level and is going to be included in this document called the Pact for the Future. So back in the days in 2021, when Portugal got to know this, and UNOSA was looking for member states to partner with to start the discussions back already in 2021, thinking about this summit is going to happen next week. Portugal offered to organize a conference called the Management Sustainability of Outer Space Activities that will happen last May. And the main goal was to discuss three topics. It was space debris, space traffic management, and space resources. These are the three elements that will be very important for the next decades, also for the future generations, since we are now going back to space in a different way, and we are using space as was not used before. And so these are the three main issues that were identified by the UN Secretary General, and was the main issues to be discussed during that conference. So to prepare that conference, we organized a few online events before, and one of the key points that we decided that should happen during this conference and the preparations of it is that the space sector has changed in the last decade or a bit more. Before, it was a nation-centered activity, but suddenly now we have industry playing in space or working in space at a totally different capacity from the past. Individuals or companies, they can build their own assets, they can launch it, they can operate it in a way that was not possible before. So we need to, in these discussions that happen at COPUS in Vienna, we need to start to have the point of view of industry. And so in the preparations of this conference, the goal was to bring not just member states, and in principle, member states were the main focus because the discussions happening next week are a prerogative and it's a discussions for member states, but we need to include industry and we need to include academics in this discussion. So we of course count with Leo Labs in this conference, also with many other industries, not just from the space segment but also from the ground segment. But it's actually one element from industries that was not envisaged, which are the companies that use space data, but they don't know they use space data, or sometimes they do, but it's not, they don't touch it, this space data. And for example, if we think about Uber, because it's one of those that we all use to take a taxi, they use space data, GNSS. And if we damage GNSS capabilities, their the way the company works, it will stop, right? So in the later stage, we will have also to bring those industries into these discussions, because their bread and butter, even though it's not space directly, it's space data. And those companies will also in the future need to be part of this discussion. So it's very good to have already here at this, we have two companies, but it's very important to have, because security, and this will link to the industries, the security aspects will influence the way the private sector works in space. So they also need to be a part of the discussions. And so we brought the industry, and it's very interesting to see that independent on the geographies, and again, we brought industry and experts from all around the globe to have the different views and the different opinions. And it's actually one of the most things that was said during this conference, the several sessions of the conference, was already mentioned here in the morning, which is access to space data. We need valuable data. We need to understand which data can be trusted, so we can have our conjunctions measurements calculated. We can know where our satellites are, what they have in their neighborhoods. So access to data, to valuable data, it was one of the most important things that was mentioned during those sessions. And through that conference, we wrote the Lisbon Declaration on Outer Space that was presented also at Copus, and the member states took good note of this document. And we believe that this document, plus the discussions that will happen next week at the Summit of the Future, will help the member states to have this discussion on space sustainability, also bringing the industry perspective that was brought into the Lisbon Declaration to this discussion. So until now, space, when you talk at UN level, it's a Vienna thing that discusses with diplomats in Vienna, with space packages in Vienna, but we need to bring this to all over UN. We need to discuss it at the highest level in New York. We need to have the heads of state fully understand what could happen to the economy if space is no longer available, or space assets are no longer available. And if we link all of this together, we can see how member states like Portugal, or like the Maldives, and as Madine mentioned before, we are at different levels of our development. We are not a spacefaring nation like others, but we do use space data. We have a word to say, and it's through policy support, it's through diplomacy, and through lawmaking that the member states can support these discussions. We should not forget industry. They are a very important part of it, and in the future even more. And maybe then we can take also questions, because time is running. But this is the main key points that I'll bring up right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugo. And I cannot agree more with what you just said there at the end about how space is an issue that affects us all. And we at Unity also encourage everybody, no matter the degree of spacefaring powers, to engage when it comes to space security, which we only do space security issues. But I think this is important across all types of space discussions, that all states should be involved in these conversations, because obviously, if you are not at the negotiating table, nobody's going to negotiate on your behalf. So it's essential that all states are part of that. But you also mentioned how the space sector has changed and how industry is such a big part of the discussion now. So welcoming industry and civil society and academia is so essential, because they bring a know-how that states might have, but they might also lack. So it can be really useful to have their point of view. So I couldn't agree more. And you also mentioned that the Portuguese Space Agency is pretty young. And I was wondering if that is because Portugal has obviously worked with ESA over the years. For example, Spain has an even younger space agency than Portugal, and it's in parts also because of that collaboration with ESA. But it's great to see states individually, even though in this context of collaboration, becoming more and more interested in space. We heard about Kenya in that first panel at the beginning. Everybody can do space, everybody uses space. But one question that brings to me in the context of this verification and monitoring discussion is whether the level of spacefaring powers can influence the priorities of states regarding verification and monitoring for space accuracy. And for non-spacefaring nations specifically, or emerging spacefaring nations, how can they contribute to verification and monitoring? Is this very different from the big space powers? And how can these nations profit from existing verification and monitoring mechanisms, in a comparable manner to other spacefaring states? So this is a question that I would pose to all of the panel, but maybe you, since you were the one that talked about this a little bit more. And before I give you the floor again, I'd like to again remind the virtual participants that you can ask your questions, and those here in the room, if you have questions, I saw some placards already. So as soon as we're done with this question, I'll call on you here in the room as well. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, Portugal joined the European Space Agency back in the year 2000. And until 2019, most of our, or all of our space activities were done via ESA. They are continuing to be done, but we also need to understand the changes in the sector, right? And again, space was mainly a place for states where everything was very dependent on states. So Portugal was part of ESA, and through ESA, our industry could access to contracts and to participate in space activities. But when you have a change and in the way space works, then you can see that it becomes easier for industry, for universities to join the space activities. You also need to start to have your own policies and national policies. And so this was mainly the drive force to set up an agency and the Portuguese space strategy. Also because we could see the interest from foreign industry about the country and the potential that the country had. And one of the things that we can see is, for example, the fact that Leo Labs joined or came to Portugal because of the geography. They need a radar in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's better to put on land than on a boat because in terms of accuracy, it's much better. So, and this is perhaps one of the aspects that members or states can benefit from their geography. If we go back in the past and the discussions that existed in the very beginning about the geo orbit, and how the countries in the geo or in the equator believe there was it was something that would belong to the equatorial countries. We can see that also geographically, if a country is in a place where it is on Earth, it can be beneficial for other spacefaring nations to have their sensors there. So it could be one opportunity for those member states to collaborate and support the monitoring toolbox. It could also a way through this, and it was mentioned before how Kenya start to work more in space through the fact that they have a university that won a contest and built a satellite, and from that was the kickoff. So when it comes to monitoring space, this could also be a way that nations that can benefit from their geography then to start to have an active role in policy making, because normally if if a member state believes that it's difficult to step in the space activities, but suddenly there's a drive force that supports them in that point, policy making is a very easy way, I would say, because what you need is brains and activities to support the discussions, and could be a very good way to step in. And Corpus is a great way for member states to have an active voice in space activities and to drive for what they believe is the best, the policies at worldwide. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I really like that point about space as a driver for collaboration through geography. And since you mentioned how LEOLAPS is now also present in Portugal, I'm going to turn to you, Darren. And to my initial question, I'm also going to add a question from the virtual audience, which is relevant to you specifically. How do you handle the installation of razors and SSA technology when you want to have that geographical diversity with countries where, you know, maybe there are geopolitical issues, or do you go through agreements through the country where you're headquartered? It might be interesting for us to learn how that works a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, so the first thing that we do, we want to find a site that's safe for the citizens of the country. So we don't plop it in the middle of a city, because we do emit RF signals, right? So we got to be a little bit away, like 5 kilometers away from airports and things like that. All we need is a football field and a fence around it, we're good. Luckily in the Azores, we had a beautiful place to go. We need to have internet, we need to have power. Less power than you need for 5 houses, and internet's a T1 line. That's really all we need. Really what we're looking for is something we can build, somebody we can build a strategic relationship with. So Hugo and I were just talking about research opportunities, for how students might work with them about some study efforts and use some of our data. And so we try to make sure we partner with people that want to be part of the ecosystem. We do not generate a lot of jobs. Our sites are unattended. We have sheep on them in New Zealand, and we got iguanas on them in Costa Rica. I don't know if we have any cows on them, you know. So, but we don't have any people. We don't make any jobs, but we help. Reputation becomes a part of the space community and allows a point for research. After that, it's pretty simple. Usually, we don't exchange. You know, we want to go in there and just lease a piece of land and do our job, so we can proliferate them around the world. But we do make sure we work very closely with the research agencies, academia in those countries, and they help us get smarter, and we help them get smarter. It's a great relationship. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Darren. You mentioned New Zealand, Costa Rica, Portugal. I feel like you're based in very interesting places where I would like to go on a holiday. So I don't know if that's intentional.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always good wine and good beaches.
So, Sarah, I would like to turn to you also, since you also worked with the rest of the UNITED team on that workshop that we did for small island nations that Madine talked in the previous panel. So going back to my original question about whether the level of spacefaring powers can influence the priorities of states regarding verification.
I will say something I think that is interesting. So we have attention spans, all of us, right? So I think that the priorities of a state and their threat perceptions will then really put a bias into what it is that they're looking for and how they're assessing things. But also what they're attentive for, right? So I think in your term of original questions with the prowess, I think you put it of a state's power, I think that will show itself in the bias of what they're looking for, and then those threat perceptions, and then what they eventually do for the data, do with the data, but then also then why they're initially acquiring it. So in the workshop that you were mentioning, it's fascinating to see that there's such an appetite for acquisition of space data, because it's absolutely essential for so many of these SDGs, but so many humanitarian operations, the list goes on. But what's not usually coupled with that is the understanding that there could be consequences of certain partnerships because of the discussions that are happening with space security, or because of threat perceptions. And so I just think that in terms of the transparency or certain things of cooperation and partnerships, that it should be, on equal footing. That partnership should be on equal footing with really understanding where both sides are coming from. But two, and more of what we're discussing with what, maybe non-spacefaring nations can do. I mean, I love this idea of the international kind of the telescopic based SSA or this partnership that we're seeing here. And I think that there's so much room for that to continue thriving. I think Modine talked also about placing more ground-based radars as well in the Maldives, or wanting to do that. So I think those are, very feasible, and they're steps that are happening now. But going back to what exists currently and this idea of rule following, I think that non-spacefaring nations can have a huge impact in making state practice for the norms and for the laws that currently exist now. So imagine if, state A was like, hey, state B, with all of your amazing space capabilities, I would actually like to use my right under the Outer Space Treaty, Article 10, to request to observe. How can this partnership look like? What can we do for this? And kind of start setting up those mechanisms for state practice. They could also do it for consultations. And I think that the non-spacefaring nations would be best poised to do this because we're talking so much earlier about geopolitical context and conflicts and struggles, and how much that permeates within these discussions. So if it comes from a non-spacefaring nation, I think that already there's going to be less bias or less ways to interpret this as something that could be done for nefarious purposes or from a strategic advantage, and could be seen more as, we're really coming into this for international cooperation. We really want to come in and start, using our rights, or being trailblazers into how others could do that too. So I think that sometimes we use the term superpowers versus middle powers. They're not middle powers at all if you could be the leaders in geopolitical dynamics and in norms setting and in implementation. And then to just maybe something else that I was thinking about with this, to take it from the state, and then we're here at the UN, so multilateral and then state, but maybe even going down to the human level and citizens. So some of the ideas of what we could do with open source information, and even there's wonderful networks of telescopes out there. I think of company that comes to top of my head, Unistellar, but they have these global based networks for telescopes, which citizens themselves can use and contribute data to this network, right? And what do you have in the registration convention? You have the apogee, the perigee, and some details as well on what that launch is. And so what you can do with this information, if you're a person who's very interested in space security and astronomy and doing things, is you can start adding more to this global network, or a community of global sciences that are more citizens based, and start contributing to the conversation in this way, so we can tie in human approaches of security at the citizen level that can then have even more impacts up. So just some thoughts there on that.
Thank you very much. I really like that last idea about how involving the individuals can be something really useful, because sometimes these discussions, they feel very far away for those who are not involved with the UN or with the space agency, but everybody loves space. Everybody has been excited about space at some point. So that's a really good point. And also I really like your point about how non-spacefaring nations, or middle powers as well, as you call them, can encourage rule following, and can actually become leaders when it comes to that rule following. And so I'm going to turn to you now, Thomas, to answer that initial question, and maybe in the context of your work, do you think that this data that you're going to make available can serve to encourage that rule following, and if so, how can it be maximized?
To be clear, I mean, my motivation for the work is not to create more rule following. Rule following for the sake of rule following is useless. What motivated the creation of those rules in the first place is less harmful interference, less risk of physical collision. And so, I mean, I was a little spicy with my numbers earlier, but you can have low compliance to the rules and still be a fantastic steward of space sustainability in other practices. I think the real fruit for this kind of work is rebalancing burdens and protections as part of the international coordination processes in space. It's a lot of burden to get protections to a corner of the radio frequency spectrum. And to put into context, the GEO rules administered by the ITU take on the order of 9 years to manifest all the way from initial proposal, announcing to the public that you want protections at a particular place and in GEO in a particular corner of the RF spectrum, all the way to actually getting on the Master International Frequency Registry. That's really long. Can we rebalance that when we are creating new rules in LEO to perpetuate the values of these rules? How much people actually follow them is not what I'm interested in, but I hope that the results of this work in particular, but also many tools like it, and I want to encourage a culture of this sort of interrogation of rule following and rulemaking practices. I hope we can encourage better rules in the future when it matters most. We're talking about accommodating the densification of the near Earth space environment. That's an ongoing process and one that gets more and more pressing every year. I'd argue that we can accommodate it. It's accommodated in GEO in that there's about 1,000 GEO satellites, but there's never been a satellite on satellite collision in GEO. There is the space debris problem extends to GEO, but it's not nearly as severe there as it is in low Earth orbit. And all countries participate in the ITU process. And there's little data in the public sphere about how much harmful interference there is, but the tiny bits of suggestions we see at the World Radio Conferences, which is quadrennial, so this is very low information here, is that there's not that much interference in GEO. And so it's an opportunity here between the last World Radio Conference in 2023 and the next one in 2027 to interrogate old rules as we make new ones. I hope that balance between burdens and protections can tip towards protections. You can get the fruits of participating in this process without working so hard for it. Because who fails in the process of burdens? It's new spacefaring nations who do not have the capacity to participate in these processes, who are not benefiting from capacity building measures because they don't really exist yet, at least in this particular category. And I think that if you were at the ITU conference, you would know that there are special protections for new spacefaring nations and allotment plans. There is no allotment plan for LEO. There's no corner of LEO carved away from the global space superpowers making the most use of it. So these conversations are absolutely ongoing, and I hope that you share some of the goals I have in making sure those processes go well for all actors, the ones at the decision-making table, the ones populating the space environment right now, and those who want to be but aren't there yet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really liked the point about burdens and protections and the balance, because one thing that I remember hearing a lot during the OEWG that concluded in 2023, especially from emerging spacefaring nations or nations who were not yet spacefaring, was precisely that a few had gone up to space when there were essentially no rules, and now there were a lot more rules. So it was harder to get to space because you had to comply with a lot more things. And so I obviously, with a legal background, I love rules, I love laws, but I do understand that these rules have to be equitable, and space is the use and exploration of space are the province of all humankind. So we have to ensure that everybody without discrimination can benefit from it. So that is an excellent point. I do see that we have a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to take a bunch, considering that we have only 15 minutes until the end of this panel. I saw here you with a name the Portugal nameplate, and then the UK as well. I see one of the youth video competition winners as well. And then I see Taniel here as well. So I'm going to take those four first, and then we can see if we have time for more, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. I'll try to keep it short. Thank you to the panelists for the rich discussion. It was fascinating. I have a question for Dr. McKnight. My question is turned toward the future, and you said it at the beginning of the discussion. You are a scientist, and I'm not. So I apologize in advance if I'm a bit out of touch with reality with my question, but I'll still give it a shot. You mentioned significant advancements in artificial intelligence, and there's also been significant improvements in intelligent cyber-physical systems for aerospace applications and satellites. So I was wondering what happens to concepts such as accountability when we delegate moral obligation and accountability to such systems? And should we avoid putting too much confidence in the operations of autonomous systems in space in the future? Is there a limit? If yes, where is the limit and who sets the limit? Thank you.
Before you answer, are you okay if we collect some more questions? Yeah.
I have to remember the question before I answer it.
Clive, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. I'll be quick. There's a bit of a debate in Paros about kind of the feasibility of verifying the behavior of objects versus verifying the nature of those space objects. And bearing in mind the technological developments that you may be aware of from your work, what are the possibilities what possibilities are going to be coming our way for verifying behaviors and for verifying the nature of space objects? So that would be very useful information for us discussing Paros issues. And one question specifically to Thomas: to what extent is the non-compliance that you have identified in geo movements intentional? Can you say that versus kind of negligent or for economic reasons, or versus kind of protecting national security issues? And is there a way to increase compliance without compromising national security? Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I'm Junyoung, and I have curious about the panel's opinion. Numerous satellites exist in the numerous locations, from a low to geostationary orbits, from a small CubeSat to a giant ISS. I wish I could, but we can't monitor everything. Space trash is also becoming more and more difficult. Is there a way to set the order? And I have one brief question about the LEO labs. That their low altitude to the geostationary orbit, I order if it measures all satellites. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Tanyel Youssef, Centre for Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. I'm actually going to wedge my question onto the back of the question from the delegate from Portugal, which I thought was excellent. And thank you for a generally excellent panel. Regard to AI specifically, I work on emerging technologies with conventional nuclear weapons and outer space applications. And I think it's linked a little to Thomas's point about rule making and rule following. AI tools and modeling can be fantastic, but of course there is an issue in that they are both used for verification, but also require verification. And I wonder how, and I'm happy to direct this at Darren, thank you. What steps do you take and what framing do you give to technologists that you work with, particularly regarding the fact that some of them don't have this wider compliance understanding necessarily, but also where we have multiple programming differentials and a lack of standardization? How can we trust the very tool that we're using to verify activities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe most of these questions were for Darren. So I'm going to give you the floor first. I just want to warn you, we have 10 minutes left. So if you could keep, I know these are complex questions, but if you could keep your responses relatively brief, that would be appreciated.
And I'll keep my answers brief also, right? So great question. It's very important. AI, I do not believe that AI should be used for decision making. Actually, it should be used for data reduction, filtering of large data sets, learning from that, and then being verified within the subject matter experts, right? To make sure that it's a virtuous cycle between AI and RI. People are responsible for making decisions. AI is there to automate things that are very well known. So I keep it a very low value chain, not at the top. Now, AI and automation are not the same thing. So you think about space operators, and I don't know if you're thinking about how people doing collision avoidance maneuvers, risk reduction maneuvers, on orbit, if that's what that what you were referring to? Because it's different. What we do for AI, like we will maximize tasking back to your question, sir, we'll maximize tasking based on artificial intelligence, say, here are the objects that we're going to see in the next hour. Let's make sure we put our resources the right way to measure them properly. We don't change the object characteristics by doing that. We just increase our probability of seeing something. And then on top of that, we do analysis about the object characteristics, right? So again, AI is usually at the low level to make more of our resources. The decision-making is done at the RI level. Okay, so I don't know if I answered your question, sir. Did I answer your question? Yeah. On the tasking, as far as looking at every single object on orbit, obviously from a space safety perspective, what you cannot see can kill you. So we like to see down to 1 millimeter, but we can't, right? So can we see down to sub 10 centimeters? Yes. Guess what? Still, we don't see those objects maybe as often as we see large objects. When it comes to space security, our level of detection is important when we talk about actual operational things that might have a capability to do something that you were not aware of, right? We want to prevent strategic surprise in space. Thought that was a CubeSat, all of a sudden it had another capability, right? We want to prevent that. So from that point of view, our tasking, everything from a 1U CubeSat and above, we see very, very well. Below that, it gets dicey. And I'm sorry, 95% of the risk of you dying from orbital debris is not covered by any conjunction data message from either the 18th Space Defense Squadron or anybody else, because objects on the order of a centimeter can kill you, and we can't give you tracks to prevent that. So being in space is still a tough game. So did I answer your question about the level of tasking for different sizes? Back to the object and behavior. That's a very good question. And I think what we do is we try to build up a corpus of data based on, as Sarah mentioned, open source work. And I'm an aerospace engineer. I'm a physicist. I'm a rocket scientist, all those things. And I tell you, power pointing, propulsion, and processing enables a payload. So we talk about the 5 Ps all the time. What's the power of the system? And that can be done by a variety of things. How big is the solar array? What's the open source information? Processing, what computer chips on there, right? Because how much information can be processed and done on orbit versus down on the ground. That makes a big difference about what that's going to be. Pointing, really critical. If I'm going to be doing something nefarious, I got to be able to point at you accurately. If I have very poor attitude stability, I can't do much up there. Right? So all those things enable the payload. So we actually break down our curation as a systems engineer, because that way the object information that we get doesn't get sort of cognitive bias. It's big, so it's bad. No, there's a lot of big things because the solar arrays are not very efficient. So they're really big because of poor design. They're not a concern. But if they're big from an RCS perspective and then from a radar cross-section perspective, and they have a very small payload on there, but a lot of power, you start to go, those don't match, right? So that's kind of how we do that. And we don't let AI do that we let RI do that for us. I think I answered all the questions well ahead of time.
Thank you. Thank you so much indeed. And there was another question for Thomas on the non-compliance in GEO, whether this is intentional or not.
So as many people in the audience are familiar, you can't measure intent from passive observation. So my tool and my entire research portfolio doesn't attempt to do that. But just so you know, the tool only measures compliance if you're in the protected GEO region as defined by the Interagency Debris Coordination Committee. So if you performed a post-mission retirement maneuver to a supersynchronous orbit, you pumped your altitude up to be outside of that region, this tool will not ding you for being outside of compliance because you don't meet the requirements for possibly being in compliance. And so in terms of negligence, you'll get a poorer compliance rating in aggregate from my tool if you don't perform retirement maneuvers, because your object will be floating around the GEO belt, constantly entering other actors' orbital protections. There was a quick question that I want to give a quick answer to. AI tools in space governance. It's just too easy to not plug an upcoming essay series from CG, one of the co-sponsors of this event. And I have an essay in that series called Using AI for Better Space Governance. And the idea is in reflection of Darren's comments, AI should not be used for decision-making. That's not a unique perspective that I have. It's shared on this panel, but it should be said as often as possible. But AI can still inform smart rulemaking in outer space. And so it's rare for an academic to spell out an entire research agenda into the long term, but I've done it for you in that essay series because I think it's more important to share some of these ideas with the community and get as much help as I can on developing these AI tools. AI is happening in schools of aerospace engineering, not just in departments of computer science. And so I'm training my students to use these tools and deploy them to contribute to this very conversation in this room. So please check out that essay and the entire CG essay series when it comes out over the course of the next few months. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I don't know if our other two panelists have something they'd like to add about these questions, or if not, alternatively, something that I would like each of you to do is to provide us with some brief concluding remarks to wrap up this panel. Maybe we can start, since you had the mic, Thomas, maybe you can go first and then we can come closer and closer to me.
I just wanted to conclude my remarks on the value of sharing as much data as possible describing on-orbit activities. Darren's catalog that you mentioned, that's actually way more than I'd ever ask for from an individual provider, where the satellite's pointing, what's the capabilities of its payload. But satellite operators hold the highest resolution data for just where their satellite is. And sharing that information on a global scale can accelerate the kinds of work that my lab does at Georgia Tech and many other projects like it that can really contribute to international dialogue at multinational fora. And I think we would all agree that we could use more data derivatives from this mountain of space situational awareness data. The mountain's only going to grow. So we need to encourage ideas to make sense of it. And I want to target accusations of bias in that data. Those are real accusations. There's real bias in that data, but we can sort of mitigate some of those concerns by encouraging actors from tiny startups to global superpowers to contribute and share standards and common practices to share that data with the global community. Thanks.
I mean, definitely agree with what you're saying of sharing data. And I think in the beginning, if we think of, okay, so verification is this process that is state-led and the state has to make that judgment, but all of this underpinning of what we're talking about can be more inclusive, right? So we have industry that's participating really with monitoring and leading with a lot of this data that's giving, but all the other things that I mentioned as well, that could be a more inclusive process from different states, from spacefaring, non-spacefaring, but to the citizen level as well. And that it's not just some of the data, but then what else can the rest of the community do is utilize what exists, think about making state practice, think about encouraging, the application and the implementation of what we have. And then also the downstream data. Hugo, you did mention how important the downstream data is to users. So communicating that importance to them as well. And then Darren, I loved so much that you said the 5 Ps, propulsion, pointing, payload, because we deal, I would much rather deal with the 5 Ps than the P5, which is what we have to deal with. So I'm like,
I'll trade you.
Yeah, so yes, but I think just ending on those notes.
Well, as a final point, perhaps, I think we all agree that space it's important for our economy, and the world economy would collapse without space data. And whatever we do today, we are not doing for ourselves, we are doing it for the next generation. So we need to take that into account to make sure that the legacy we leave to the next generations will not be disrupted by what we are doing today in space. And you mentioned the downstream, and for example, if we bring up the Copernicus system from the European Commission, which is an Earth observation system, where it states that the data is free and accessible to all. Of course, this can also bring security aspects on the ground, but the fact that the data is accessible through all world, it means that even those states that don't have capabilities, they can use the data and they can produce information through this data that is available and is paid and built in Europe, but it's worldwide, free and available to all. One of the aspects during our conference was the access to data. We, and was mentioned already here before, we of course need to share data. It was also mentioned in the morning that we all have, let's say, the common goals of using space in a peaceful way. So if we have all of these in mind, there will be a point that we'll all agree and share data. It might take long, it might take a short time, but we'll reach that point. And for example, in Europe, we have the SST, which is also a European space surveillance technology to monitor the space, to monitor space. Just yesterday, I was in inauguration of the optical sensor from a Portuguese company that is now also operating to detect debris in space and support companies. So I think in the long run, we'll get there, but we need to share data, and we need, through all of the brands in the world that we have working in space, to see the best way you can use this data for the benefit of all. Thank you.
So I'm going to riff off of Hugo's line there, and I think that the more we focus on space security, I think the more poorly we're going to do it. All right. So I'm going to tell you, there's behaviors in space. If we start doing 3 things, I believe that space security will become easy. One of the first things, like Hugo said, sharing data. Space traffic management is one of the pillars to worry about with all these new constellations. People should share the propagated ephemeris with the world. Starlink, who people like to poke at, because they did 25,000 risk reduction maneuvers last year. By the way, they're like granny on the highway, putting the blinker on, keeping 5 car lengths. It's because they're safe. They're doing so many risk reduction maneuvers. They put their 3-day propagated ephemeris for every satellite on a public website for everybody to use. If everyone did that, we'd start to see it's okay to share data, and we're not losing any state secrets. Number 2, debris mitigation. Talk about 25-year rule. Why is it okay to leave anything that's non-functional more than a month? Why? If your car broke down on the highway, would you leave it there for a couple months because I don't need it? No. So again, if we start, why do we have to be told to pick up our trash? Why? I don't understand it. So I think, again, if countries showed leadership to say, I'm not going to leave objects up there when they're not functioning, it's just not very smart. The third thing is active debris removal. We have a lot of objects that have been left up there for decades. I do something called the conjunction of the fortnight. Every 2 weeks, I do an analysis of a close approach. And if you want to be kept up at night because you're afraid, tell me you want them and I'll send them to you. But you'll be afraid when you hear how many close approaches we're getting with objects that were launched decades ago. Why is nothing being done about picking up the old objects? Because those were government programs, US, Russia, China, that put them up there. Now the governments need to show some leadership to remove them. It's not up to the commercial space, the commercial operators to clean up the mess from decades old stuff. If we could get together, the 3 major space powers, let's go pick up some stuff, that old stuff that's been dead for decades. I think we'll find out it's not so hard to work together. So I may sound like the glass is half full. Victoria, we started off with you saying the glass is half full. The glass is 3/4 full. But let's do some things that don't have space security. And I bet we'll find out the space security isn't hard because we'll be working with each other in a collaborative way. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. This was truly an excellent panel. I think one point where you all pretty much seem to agree is that sharing of data is very important, that it can contribute to improve monitoring and verification. And also I like to highlight one point that Sarah mentioned at the beginning, which I think is also very important. Well, 2 points actually. First, that no verification mechanism is going to be perfect. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that no matter how much data we share, we're never going to know everything that's happening all the time. And that it's important to use these different data points that we receive from different sources all together. That when you use just one verification or monitoring mechanism, it loses efficacy. So it's best to use them together. But it's great to wrap up this conference with this idea that cooperation is so important, and it's such a positive note or as somebody said yesterday, I think it was Clive, in fact, he said, positive vibe, let's continue to keep the positive vibes going. So I would encourage all of you here. We have, people from that are representing states, we have people that are representing industry, we have people from academia, from civil society. So we really have a very diverse group here in the room in Geneva, but also joining us virtually. And this idea of cooperation between all stakeholders is very, very important. And it's also important to remember, as Hugo said, that we are all stakeholders when it comes to space. Everybody uses space in some way, whether you are a state, a member of academia, civil society. If you're a human, you're using space. So it's important to remember that, and that's the reason why we should care about these issues that we've been addressing during this conference, space security. And in fact, I'd like to wrap this up with a sentence from our youth video competition winners. I believe it was Prajna that she said in her video that space security is not about weaponizing space, is not about war in space, but rather about ensuring that it's kept peaceful and secure, precisely about avoiding all of those negative things, all of those things that we fear. So it's very encouraging to see that so many of you are interested in continuing these discussions. It's great to see that even though, sometimes people will say, oh, the UN is very slow, states don't agree on anything, but we just had a DG consensus report, the first consensus reports on Paris, which is a huge success. So we can build on that. We can build on that great success as we move on to the next stage of space security discussions, which might be 1 OEWG, as we said yesterday, or it might be 2. We will see that in the future. But I am looking forward, and I hope you are too, to see how we can continue to ensure that the goals of Paris are achieved, and that we can all together work towards ensuring that space is kept peaceful and secure. And from us at Unity, we will be there to support states in this endeavor, and we will also be there to encourage others to continue thinking about these issues and to work with all of you. So now we have reached the end of this Outer Space Security Conference, which I think has been really, really great. The panelists, the discussions, they've been really engaging and really inspiring, especially as we now move on to first committee in a few days, and the Summit of the Future as well, as was said. So it's been a wonderful 2 days where we have gathered to share analysis, findings, insights and ideas to allow us to find solutions to the urgent challenges of space security. I would like to thank, of course, all of our panelists. This would not be possible without your expertise, and also all of the moderators for the great discussions. Thank you as well to all of the attendees, both in person and here virtually. I know that in the case of the virtual speakers and participants, some of you are joining us from weird time zones. It might be very early in the morning for you or very late at night. So we really appreciate your dedication and your passion for space security. We would encourage you, and we would invite you to provide us with any feedback that you may have. You can do that by reaching out to us via email. You can approach us here at the podium or later as we start to exit this conference room. But we also have feedback forms for those here in the room. They have been distributed. For those joining virtually, a link has been posted in the chat, and you also have a QR code on the screen. You will also be receiving an email with a link to this feedback form. This is anonymous. This is really brief. It will not take you more than 2 minutes. And this is really helpful for us at Unity to improve our events as we move forward. Thank you to everyone also working behind the scenes to make this event possible. Our producer and videographer, Mael. Also our producer, Letitia, and the Unity team which is composed by Sarah Ratanshu, Louisa, Jamie. Thank you for all of your work. Thank you also to our partners from the Secure World Foundation, Victoria, who is here, and Peter, who could not join us this time around, as well as to our partners from CG, including Jessica, Jenny, and Aaron, all of whom are here, and Tim and Son, who were not able to come this time around, but who have been instrumental in making this conference a success. Also, OS24 would not be possible without the financial and organizational supports from the governments of the Republic of Chile, the People's Republic of China, France, Norway, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, and again, also the Center for International Governance Innovation and the Secure World Foundation. Thank you very much for everything, and we hope to see you all next year for OS25.